Thank you everyone for joining. And for those who don't know me, I am Tamsin Ratcliffe and I lead the work of the Impact Trust and the Resilience Funders Network. And I'm joined by Stan Wu, who is my colleague at Omega and the Resilience Project at Commonweal. And we're going to be the backup to Tom for the evening. I don't want to take too much time from the conversation because I know that your being here is for Jeremy. But I really wanted to say thank you for joining this, which is the first of what I think of as a series of conversations or dialogues, as Tom prefers to call them, which is really looking at how we can navigate the polycrisis collectively in ways that would inform all of our work individually and collectively. And I know there will be some discussion about the word polycrisis or metacrisis, as Jeremy and Bill prefer to use. So talking about the web of meaning this evening, I am very excited that actually we're starting this on the equinox, which no matter where we are in the world is really symbolizing balance and equilibrium. For some of us in the north, it's probably also the spring, it is the spring equinox, which of course has so many other aspects that are part of what we hope this conversation will evoke around renewal, rebirth, reawakening, and really potency for initiating activity and new beginnings. And I think that astrological significance, which most people who know me will know that astrology is one of my things, really speaks to both personal and the collective. And so it's really fantastic to have so many of you here this evening. And somebody is not on mute. Sorry, can I just ask if anyone can just mute their mics when they come in? So it's with that hope that you join these series of conversations. I know Stan will put the link into the chat if you haven't seen the other conversations that are happening after that. But I'm going to hand over now to Tom Lent, who is neither Jeremy's brother nor cousin, but I'm very sure there must be a connection somewhere. And he's going to help us through the flow of this evening. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tamsin, and everyone who's joined us today. Just a few housekeeping things and kind of the outline of our dialogue, our conversation today to make sure we get from where we are to where we want to go. We will be recording, and please turn off your audio unless you're speaking. And this is meant to be participatory and engaging, so please raise your hand when you want to participate because there's 60, 70, 80 people in this, and we want to make sure everybody's voice is heard in one way or the other. So we will use the chat box as an active function of conversation and a form of participation. So please put in your ideas, your comments, your reflections in the chat box, and Tamsin and Stan are going to be monitoring that, as well as myself, as we go forward to make sure that at the right time we'll let Jeremy catch his breath and we can make comments and challenge each other and build on each other's ideas. The other thing is that, again, as Tamsin said, I prefer the word dialogue because the ancient Greek concept of dialogue was that, unlike discussion, which is percussion and back and forth, win and lose, dialogue is the creation of meaning among a group of people that builds on what each of us brings in, but collectively we go beyond and build through listening and building on each other. We go beyond and create new meaning that takes us further. So that's the deeper meaning of dialogue, or the deeper hope is that by listening and talking with each other, we can create new meaning and move forward. The other is kind of notionally then, after this brief 3 or 4 minutes setting the stage, we'll hand it over to Jeremy, and he'll talk with us for a while and initiate the dialogue. And then please put in the chat what your comments or your questions that you have. And then we'll leave it open after maybe 30, 40 minutes. Let's see how the flow goes. This is not a set piece orchestra. This is more a jazz session. So let's as within the true meaning and spirit of systems, we can self-organize for something bigger and better. And then after kind of an open conversation among the 70 or 80 of us, we'll get back and let Jeremy then comment on what he's heard and some of what has stimulated his thinking and where he thinks we should be going. And then we'll conclude at the end, last 10 or 15 minutes, to give everybody a chance to make comments, what's next, and where do we go from here.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind,
Is it only me that has found you good?
yeah. Tamsin shared with us her belief that we're in a kind of a meta crisis or poly crisis, and we need to explore, dialogue, and act together. She used the words navigate, renew, rebirth, reawakening, personal and collectively. And we need to have conversations not only about the why and the what to do, but how to do it. And Jeremy talks too about being grateful and getting beyond being optimistic and pessimistic, but have hope and humility as we go forward. In his 2017 book, Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, and in his 2021 book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And then more recently, in his January 2024 article on the eco-civilization framework, and how do we get to where we are from and where we need to be as a civilization. So those three works will be kind of the framework for today, and we're going to let him talk to us about how he got there and where he thinks we need and should go next. And Jeremy goes into depth and the causes and the roots, the systems and the structures, policies and practices and relationship and mental models and belief systems. And what he says, metaphors that got us to where we are and where we need to go from here, and kind of leads us into a global movement in coalition to catalyze a global transformation. So I think we all kind of are at the stage where we feel the need to go beyond from where we are, to go beyond the normal conversations, to go beyond and to try to co-create collectively a response or a future that's more proportionate and relevant to the problems we face. So just as a background, of the 100 he sets out in his books and say of the largest economies in the world, 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are corporations. And 26 billionaires own as much wealth as half of the world's population. We're in the process of the sixth great extinction. Coral reefs, glaciers, rainforest, depletion of topsoil, freshwater, global warming, and what he says could be the first extermination event. Half of the world's estimated 8 million species could be extinct by the end of the century. And part of the problem of this, as he says, it's the ideology or the metaphor of human supremacy and nature as a machine. And we need we have old metaphors that hold the problems in place. And he talks about the needs for new metaphors, new meanings that will get us from where we are to where we need to be, and shifts the fundamental rights of sentient beings and faith in the dignity and worth of all life forms. So with that in mind, Jeremy, please tell us about how you got to the patterning instinct and the web of meaning, what led you there, and then you have a third book in mind, and we'd love to hear where you're going with this, and we're in your hands. Thank you.
Wow, Tim, thanks for that introduction. A fantastic summary of all that I've written over the years. I'm not sure if I could have summarized it more clearly than that. And yeah, well, I guess maybe a place to begin is to that question that you asked. How did I get to end up writing these books? And you might have noticed when Tom was talking about the titles of both books, one thing they had in common, the Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning and The Web of Meaning. They both have the word meaning like in their title or subtitle. And for me, really, it was a kind of a crisis of meaning and my own search for meaning that led me to write these books, essentially. In the first half of my life, I actually spent in a very different mindset, in a very different world. I got an MBA and started an internet company back in their first internet .com phase. And what happened to me is that actually in the middle of all that, my wife at the time, who passed away some years back, and she got sick, and I left this company that had been real successful, one of the sort of internet IPOs and really sort of making waves. But I left it too early, and it went from being one of the dot-com booms to one of the dot-com crashes, basically. And I went through years of my life when I was essentially looking after my wife, who had was suffering basically like borderline dementia. So even I was really, really alone with her, but completely like no longer actually connected with her in a meaningful way. And all the things I built around myself during that first part of my life, it sort of crashed around me. And I sort of realized, I'm midway through my life, there's a different direction I can take. But I made a vow to myself, it was going to be truly meaningful. And I realized I had no idea what that actually was. And I wanted it to be meaningful, not just to my head, but my heart and my body. And so I'd actually, as an undergraduate in Cambridge years earlier, I'd been an undergraduate in English literature. But in the business life I'd had, I basically hadn't read a book in years and years. And then I was voracious and I started wanting to understand, where did meaning come from? The words that we take for granted, whether it's like God or soul or humanity or just any of these things. I wanted to peel the onion basically and say, where did that come from? Where did that come from? It took me all the way from like history to anthropology, then to cognitive science, and then to evolutionary biology. And I also looked at the way that recognizing the different cultures made totally different meanings out of the universe. So it was kind of through this whole process, at some point I was going, God, I would love to, if there were a book that could have given me that sort of guide as I was doing this search, how valuable that would be. And so I started to put my own research together into these books. And that first one is more of a historical analysis, really, of how different cultures, we can sort of almost like metacultures, like hunter-gatherer cultures all around the world, or agrarian civilizations, but how they do make meaning out of the universe based on these core root metaphors of meaning. So hunter-gatherers might have a core metaphor of nature being a giving parent. And from that, you get natural implications. Like, well, if nature's a giving parent, you can trust nature. And if nature's a giving parent, then all that you see around you are your relatives. And so you're all connected and have intrinsic worth. So that's how that works. Whereas, of course, our modern worldview has more like a root metaphor of nature is a very complicated machine, which you go, oh, if it's a complicated machine, if we break it down in little parts, we can figure out how to make it work to our advantage, which is, of course, what the scientific project has done so powerfully the last 500 years, incredibly well, but to the point that it is now actually leading us to a path of destruction. And that second book I wrote, The Web of Meaning, sort of went from almost like if that first book was like the diagnosis, the second book kind of lays a framework for what we can do about it. And it was really my own, as I went through these years of research, I got to discover that actually there was a way to connect with meaning that could be scientifically rigorous and also spoke to my heart and my spirit, or whatever whatever words we might want to use. And to me, the breakthrough came from discovering systems thinking. When I first started trying to understand things, I went to the classics the mainstream classics like Richard Dawkins, Selfish Gene, and we're all just selfish, and our genes are selfish, and that's the way it is, and we're all just little billiard balls in a meaningless universe. Sorry, you better get used to it. So I was prepared to get used to that reality, and then I discovered actually that's a limited version of reality. And when I discovered people like Fritjof Capra and systems thinking, and then discovered that actually some of the earlier cultures and traditional cultures of the world, like Chinese civilization, described the world in ways very similar to the way systems thinkers describe the world, this interconnected web of meaning. And that was what really shifted my own direction, my own understanding, and caused me to write this book, The Web of Meaning, which basically, well, I mean, the subtitle integrates science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. So clearly it does that. It shows the distinction between science and spirit, traditional wisdom, whatever word you want to use, is a made-up distinction of our dominant culture and doesn't actually exist in any meaningful way. And so what that book does is it looks at those core questions that any of us ask at some point in our lives, like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Why am I? And in each case, it shows how our dominant worldview leads us, it's not just to this path of destruction, but it's plain wrong. It's based on early scientific thought from the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries, and has been totally superseded by a more comprehensive understanding of that sort of systemic way of looking at the world as a complex, self-organized system, and how that leads to the same deep insights of of traditional wisdom about our deep interconnectedness. So anyway, so that's kind of my own trajectory.
Thanks, and we'll wait for people to kind of put in the chat box some of their impressions or ideas, but why don't you share with us some of your ideas, and you'll get to that in the Web of Meaning, the shifts that you see in the world that get us from where we are to where we actually need to be, the shifts in cities, communities, education, economics, the triple bottom line, governance, the rights of nature, some of those ideas about metaphors and mental model shifts and belief systems that we need to change in order to move forward.
Sure, yeah, well, I guess maybe the first place to sort of begin, before we even look at the specifics of the things you mentioned, is that it's the deepest shift that ultimately is most important, which if we take this idea that the foundational metaphor that we use to make sense of the world then leads to all these implications, and that sort of scientific metaphor, or the reductionist metaphor of nature as a machine, leads us to naturally think, well, if nature's a machine, well, we can exploit nature as much as we want. And nature basically is a resource. It doesn't have any intrinsic worth of its own. And if we break everything down to individual parts, and we recognize, well, then each of us as individuals are nothing other than our own individuality. So it makes sense to just want to optimize for myself. And that, of course, leads to the worldview, that worldview of extraction and exploitation, which really capitalism is the economic manifestation of that worldview, saying just exploit everything you can to your own benefit. But when you follow the logic of this web of meaning, you get to a different kind of core metaphor, which really is that metaphor of all of our shared realities being this interconnected web. And once you begin to recognize that, it leads not just to different ways in which we see our own identity or how we relate to others around us or the natural world around us, but also relates to how we can imagine or reimagine our society or our civilization. And in fact, the book, The Web of Meaning, ends on this kind of vision of what could our civilization look like if it were built on the foundation of that different kind of life-affirming metaphor. So if our dominant civilization right now is built on extraction and exploitation, and built on sort of basically prizing wealth accumulation and power, what would it look like if we actually designed our civilization to set the conditions for everyone to thrive on a thriving and regenerated living earth. And what I began to realize, I actually just came across this phrase, ecological civilization, as I was working through this book, The Web of Meaning. And people like David Corton, one of the leading thinkers who actually helped me to understand what this idea is about. And once I saw that phrase, something really lit up in me, because I went, oh, wow, this is talking not just about something like, oh, we need to rethink economics, like ecological economics or something like that. It actually gives the scope that we need to look at transforming every aspect of our entire civilization. And it gives a sense of how we can rethink it based on what is life affirming, but essentially based on the principles of life. So I've really embraced that phrase. And right now, as you mentioned, I'm actually writing a book called Ecological Civilization, and this subtitle, How We Can Create a Flourishing Future. So the notion is that every single aspect of civilization, people have already been doing the work to rethink how each different aspect, whether it's education, urban design, like technology, agriculture, you name it, and on money issuance, like the law, every aspect of our what we think of as civilization, people have looked at how this way it's currently working is not working, is actually destroying flourishing, and they've looked at different alternatives. So what I'm trying to do in this book, and I'm happily to talk more about it, is to kind of weave together all the great insights people have already accomplished, not just ideas about how we can do things differently, but on the ground realities, on the ground communities where people are actually doing things in different ways, working in sort of commons-based structures, for example, to actually look at how we can organize ourselves differently and make it work. So the idea is really, there's this famous phrase, Slavoj Žižek is often given as the person who first said it. But basically, it's easier for most people to visualize the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. So the idea behind this book and the whole vision of ecological civilization is to realize we can actually visualize an alternative. Margaret Thatcher's famous thing, Tina, there is no alternative, was her favorite phrase. Actually, there is an alternative. And I think what we can do is flesh out that alternative together so that new generations of people who rejecting what they see around them can actually embrace something and work together to achieve it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Actually, there's a couple of several good comments emerging in the chat box. Bill, do you mind unmuting and also bringing on your picture as when you're going to be speaking and talking? Feel free to go visual. And Bill made some comments about, is complexity and systems theory about the result of advanced science? Science does not stop with Newtonian. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, you've basically said it. Jeremy seems to lump all of science into Newtonian analytic mechanics. And I was simply pointing out that the complexity theory and many of the ideas you're talking about have come about from scientific investigation as well. It's the advancing, I suppose, frontier of our knowledge about the nature of reality. So Newtonian science, the mechanics you're talking about, is not wrong. It's merely incomplete. It describes there are mechanical phenomena in the universe, and someone else has pointed out that if you look at the way in which the universe is unfolding and stars rotate around or planets around their suns and stars within galaxies, that's all pretty much described by Newtonian analytic mechanics. It's not the whole picture, it's just the way some things are.
Well, yeah, thanks for that, Bill. And I couldn't agree more. And in fact, a lot of what I write about in the Web of Meaning is to your point exactly. And in fact, I make a point really of distinguishing between what I call reductionist science and science. I think science as a human project And science actually has itself a value system, which is one that I totally embrace, a value system of transparency, of being open and curious, trying to understand the world in a more open way. And so I think that's a huge, important distinction you make. And I also agree with what you wrote in the chat, that it's not the reduction, there's nothing wrong with reductionism. And it's incredibly powerful, and it works in a lot of cases. It's incomplete as an expression of our entire universe. And where I do think people go wrong is when they become what I call ontological reductionists. And as I'm sure you well know, there's a whole field of people. There's like people like Nobel Prize winner Stephen Weinberg and so many others who actually say it's almost what Stuart Kauffman, a great complexity scientist, called nothing buttery, where they basically say the universe is nothing but like little things that connect with each that bounce around each other, and humans are nothing but a whole bunch of neurons that connect to create, and life is not. And actually what system science is, it's all that, and there's this emergent quality that gets when you look at a coherence that arises from complex systems interacting to lead to a different layer, which absolutely it does not deny all the validity of reductionism, but denies that from an ontology standpoint is the way to understand the only way to understand the universe. So thank you for pointing out very important distinction, Bill.
Yeah, Jeremy, in your work, you talk a lot of the central theme is the interconnectedness, right? Why don't you talk then a little bit more about it's not if and or, but it's both and, right? So
yes,
it's what is this connection among the elements that creates?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, exactly. Well, I think the best way to look at this is if we maybe take this and apply it to human organization. I mean, and basically what complexity science, as Bill and I were just going over, looks at the way when different elements work together, you get emergent capabilities. Essentially, the system then becomes more than just the separate parts. And for example, there's a great system scientist called Evan Thompson, talks about what's called reciprocal causality, where in any complex system, as anything as tiny as a cell or as large as an ecosystem, all the different parts affect each other and affect the whole, and the whole at the same time affects the different parts. So that's why it's kind of reciprocal causality. It's not just one, and it makes it very basically impossible to predict exactly what that system is going to do next, which is very important when we look at our global civilization as a complex system, because we realize we can't know exactly how things are going to work. And a very important way, when we apply that to life, for example, what we discover, what evolutionary biologists can now tell us, is with the great transitions, the great evolutionary transitions that led to the complexity of life on Earth that we see today, actually arose not from different species learning how to outcompete each other, but actually learning how to work together in a process called mutually beneficial symbiosis that's led to this greater and greater complexity. And each one of the great transitions of life arose from greater degrees of mutually beneficial symbiosis. And this is one of the great ideas around an ecological civilization. What happens if we apply that notion of, essentially it's like a positive sum game versus a zero sum game? What happens if we apply that notion to human society? And what then you begin to realize is this notion that this sort of misstatement of Adam Smith, because it's not what he actually said, but it's what neoliberals like to describe them. He said that, basically by everyone competing against each other, this is the actual phrase he used, the invisible hand that allows everything to work so perfectly. Actually, when everyone is competing and everything is competing against each other, it leads to suboptimal outcomes. But there are ways to set conditions for humans to actually cooperate with each other can lead to more optimal outcomes. And you get people like the economist Elinor Ostrom, who came up with Principles of the Commons, who shows how that is actually has been the case empirically in different societies around the world over many centuries. And there's a great evolutionary biologist called David Sloan Wilson, who, along with E.O. Wilson, came up with basically the theory of what's called multi-level selection that looks at this notion of how you can get different emergent layers of evolutionary transition over time. And he's worked with Ellen Ostrom to look at the conditions that could actually enable humans to act pro-socially together in ways that can be scalable, all the way from small groups, all the way to basically our global society. These are some of the exciting ideas around that potential transformation towards an ecological civilization.
Thanks for that completion. Let's turn to Walter Warmeyer. Walter, if you don't mind unmuting and putting on your screen. He's made several comments that kind of intertwine with what you're saying, Jeremy.
Oops. Yes. Oh my God, where do I start? First of all, really interesting. I think we don't really appreciate how much more important cooperation is over competition in resource allocation, in developing of habitable lifestyles for individuals, for species, for participants and ecosystems. And I think that's something which I think I'm very grateful, Jeremy, that you highlight that, because in our market economies, we always seem to think that if you all, like Huxley has said, if you all behave like vultures, we end up as doves. And I think that's not really where I think we ethically should be going, but also in terms of resource allocation, it makes sense to go that way. There's something in complexity theory that I think is also not necessarily fully sort of, I don't think it's fully appreciated, which is that if you talk about complex systems, the majority of those systems are actually not being designed by humans, right? So
Yes.
If you talk about culture, if you talk about language, if you talk about complex traffic interactions, if you talk about market behaviors, and so on and so on. There's a whole bunch of systems, including maybe corporate cultures and organizations, but I think Tamsin can talk much more about that one. We have a whole bunch of systems that actually we are benefiting from, but they're not part of our design. We have not sat down and made a plan on how to speak. So what makes us think, or where does the arrogance come from that we seem to be assuming that we want to control systems that we have neither designed nor really can determine? So I think there's something in there.
Yeah, interesting ideas there. And one thing I would point out is just the word control that you used. I think, when we do look closely at complex systems and recognize that we live and we are part of complex systems, we realize we can't control them. But having said that, I think it's important not to go the other extreme and say, oh, well, look, there's nothing we can do. Just let the stuff just go where it will. We can influence complex systems. And I think that's always the challenge, is by understanding both the system itself, or getting deeper layers of understanding, and recognizing our own interaction, both as an individual agent and collectively with that system, we can begin to get wiser for how we can influence the system to lay the possibilities or lay the likelihoods that it may move in a certain direction rather than another direction. And I think that gives us more of a humility, but also a sense of agency with what is doable. So I just wanted to make that distinction. But to your point about the systems we live in all around not being designed for humans, I think this is crucial. And this is really one of the messages of this book I'm writing right now. And this has been in my own research, kind of profound discoveries I've made. We think, or like it's natural for us to assume that the systems, the institutions that we're part of, things like the way that banks issue money, or the way that the law works, or just these kind of, or the way we electoral democracy works, it's natural for us to think, well, that's kind of the best thing we've muddled through as human beings, and this is the best we've come to. And as you do the deep analysis, as I did that deep analysis, began to understand that every one of these systems has not been designed for the flourishing of humans or for the well-being of society as a whole. At each case, they've been designed for basically the elites, the very, very top elites, the power and financial elites, to essentially design systems to maintain their power over the rest of humanity. And it took a while for me to realize how profoundly true that is. In each case, the notion of law and with things like the way that private property is considered to be, essentially, if you have private property, you have no obligation to society for what you do with that property. That's just one of the fundamental tenets. And some of these ideas we can and should rethink, or the idea that banks issue money, like a for-profit entity in our society is the one that actually gets to issue the money in the way that they choose to increase the level of debt around the world. Unnecessary. It's been designed not for the benefit of our society as a whole. And there are ways that we can, once we begin to look at those deeper layers, we can begin to look at some of those things that Tom was talking earlier, specifics, things like the potentials for a universal basic income, or rather than the way electoral democracy is conducted right now, which is highly undemocratic, emphasizing things like citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, things that are being done successfully, but right now at very small scales, but recognizing that they're sort of proof of concepts that could be applied basically on much, much larger scales to really redefine our civilization, to really design it according to human flourishing on a flourishing earth.
So we have a series of comments in the chat box, and let's go through those before we ask you to comment. Jeremy, we'll go in this order. Timothy, Randy, Jane, Aletta, and Sohila, okay? So let's go through those kind of comments and conversations, and then we'll ask Jeremy to respond to those, okay? So Timothy, we're in your hands. If you don't mind unmuting and coming on screen.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes. Hey there, Timothy.
Hi there. Good to meet you, or at least see you at last. Yeah, I was making some general comments about the fact that the only really good example of a complex system that we know, in the sense that you're talking about, one that can only be understood holistically, is really this planet Earth. But we look out into the sky and we see an incredible amount of stuff that, quite frankly, is not as interesting for the most part, unless you're really looking for the origins of everything in some fantastic symmetry of the who knows what. So I have to say that it's kind of depressing in a way that the universe would be that way, and that our little planet should be so wonderful is perhaps a consolation. But our planet is in serious danger, and we are the reason for that. And none of us are innocent. So, yeah, you're certain that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Just to cut things to the chase here.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that,
yeah,
Timothy. Randy,
thanks
can
for
we
that.
go to you?
Yeah, perhaps I could speak to a couple of things around that. One is I agree with you, Timothy, that I think there is, if we look at the spectrum of levels of complexity, I think the greatest jump in that level of complexity that we know of in the universe is absolutely the autopoiesis, the creation of life on this earth. And that is, there are complex systems out there, and there are some physicists who will actually say that just if you go really deep to the levels of quarks and string theory and things like that, you see that level of complexity in the very fabric of the universe itself. That's kind of so beyond my layer of understanding that I'll just take their words for that. I won't even try to make sense of it myself. And I'd be careful of people who are not actual physicists who do try to make that.
I myself am also dubious.
but anyway, whether that is the case or not, I think that the crucial thing is to recognize this miracle of life, of which not just that we know it here, but we are life. Each one of us is this manifestations of life on this earth. And I also think we need to recognize that while we don't know of any other life forms or any other self-organized autopoietic entities outside of what is on Earth right now, I personally think that because of the vastness of the universe, there's probably a very, very good chance there are all kinds of other entities that would, and cultures and things that would fill that meet those criteria, but we don't know of them. So as far as we know, this is the only way that life, basically the universe, we can think of ourselves as humans with our sort of meta level of consciousness as really the universe, for the only instance that we know of in the universe, able to see itself and reflect on itself. It's really quite miraculous when we notice it like that. And it just raises the stakes of the importance of how we absolutely have this existential responsibility to not screw up this incredible human emergence on this earth. And I think one of the most fundamental things we need to do in terms of that shifting of our realities is to really see ourselves not as sort of humans that are so separate from the rest of life that we can just view it as a resource in that sort of reductionistic way, but actually view ourselves really as almost like Gaia's self-awareness, that Gaia, through human evolution, has evolved the ability to see itself and to act on itself in an intentional, conscious way, to be aware of its place in the entire universe. And if we can begin to see ourselves in that way of relating with the rest of life, I think it gives us this opportunity to see that there is a potential future. Essentially, really ultimately moving from what is commonly termed the Anthropocene to what the eco-philosopher Glenn Ulbricht, an Australian eco-philosopher, has called the Symbiocene. Like, if we can actually make that shift, basically that shift in the short term towards an ecological civilization, but longer term, we could essentially evolve into the Earth itself as an entity of which humans are its sort of agentic, self-aware parts, really being able to live in a symbiotic relationship with the rest of life for far, far longer, obviously, than the Anthropocene would allow a situation to go on. So that sort of just tees it up in what I see as the most important ways to make sense of the very important things you said, Timothy.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. We'll go to Randy, Jane, Aletta, Sohila, Brian, and also Bill will lead us into that next session about how to, which Jeremy can cap up for us. So let's listen a little bit to some of the participants, and then we'll ask, after we go through this next group of Randy, Jane, Aletta, Sohila, and Brian, we'll ask Jeremy to respond, okay? So, Randy, if you don't mind, if you could turn on your...
Yeah, I think I'm on. A friend who's actually on this call once counseled, quit talking about what you want, say in terms of an ecological civilization, talk about how you're going to get it. So Jeremy, I'm just asking, how do you see what you've learned translating into us getting to an ecological civilization in a timely manner?
Yes, well, I do think one of the most important things that has been missing from this movement for transformational change has been really a shared collective vision of what is possible. And so that's why I do think, in a way, if we think in terms of complex systems, you can think of a shared vision of this life-affirming future as being a little bit like an attractor that begins to help concentrate and help amplify all the different forces of people working on fixing things right now towards this shared possibility. But in terms of what, ultimately, it's a profoundly important question you're asking. It's so far, the vision of an ecological civilization is so far from our current reality. And everything we see around us, day after day, year after year, is this juggernaut of destruction moving us absolutely in the wrong direction, closer and closer to a precipice. And I think that it's really within that dynamic that actually I see the greatest hope, ironically. And it's not that I'm far from encouraging the destruction, the devastation that we see taking place in our world today. Every time this happens, it's caused terrible suffering that we should do everything we can to avoid. But as a result of what we're seeing, basically the internal contradictions of a capitalist system that is based on never-ending growth and extraction and exploitation, it's as if we see the entire thing unraveling. And if we can sort of imagine a rug, for example, we don't like the pattern of the rug and we want to change the pattern. But you can't do it because it's really tightly woven. But imagine that rug itself starts to unravel. It opens up degrees of freedom to start to reorganize from within that rug, change the patterns of the rug before the entire thing unravels. And I think that frames the fundamental challenge that everyone who's a change maker ultimately has working together is, as this system unravels, which it's doing, can we work within it? Can we create what the system scientist Ilya Prigogine called islands of coherence within a sea of chaos? Can we actually start to make these changes happening from within so that once that civilization gets to the point where it's really falling apart, maybe those islands of coherence themselves kind of become strong enough, connecting with each other to create almost like a new continent, if you will, that people can begin to join and move into. So I think it's a lot like that old quote from Buckminster Fuller, don't change the system, but create the new system from within. And I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to, taking this vision of life-affirming futures, work in communities to actually build what is possible from within. But just as importantly, is not just focusing on what we're doing in a smaller group, but then connecting with others who are doing similar things. Because it's only through those connections that we can begin to weave together a fully alternative, coherent future.
Yeah, what Bill calls an adequate theory of social change later on. But thanks. Can we hear from Jane, Aletta, Sohila? And then Tindasai, we can get to you, I think, but let's hear from our participants first, and then Jeremy, once we hear from Jane, Aletta, Sohila, because their questions are similar, and then we could get a response from you if you don't mind. Jane?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm fascinated. This resonates a lot with me. I don't know how coherent I am right now, but the original question I put in the chat was more sort of towards this whole, reductionist worldview and the temptations, I want to call them, of sort of simplification, oversimplification of the complexity of our world. And I sometimes think that, that actually also has to do with the limitations of our perception. Our brains have evolved from a fairly, basic hunter-gatherer brains, and now we've created this world which is so incredibly complex with digital everything, and we're completely out of it. And so I think that would be something I would like to hear your comments on. But also, you did mention a scholar who worked on principles to inspire cooperation between humans. And I didn't catch the name, unfortunately. I thought that was interesting. I'd like to read a bit more about that. So if you could share that name, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, if we could go to
everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. If we go to Aletta and Sohila, and then we'll hear from Jeremy again, okay?
Yes, thank you. I'm linking on to what Jane was saying is I would just like you to give us a bit more insight into these conditions that you remark on that have been identified that would foster cooperation between human beings. And then I haven't actually put it into the chat, but something that I've been involved now for many, many years in this movement of trying to affect some change at local, small scale. And one constantly hits a barrier in terms of accessing financial resources to enable people to do anything, because somehow, the resources of the world are still locked into this capitalist system that has no desire to actually foster anything else. So if you have any ideas as to how one would overcome those challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Aletta. And actually, Sohila and Tendasai also have kind of building on the same idea. Let's hear from them, and then Jeremy will ask you to respond, okay? So, Sohila?
Yes, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jeremy. It's really a fascinating discussion. And I think you also started addressing my question, especially in response to the question from Randy. And mine was around the sense of urgency that we have to do something about what's happening, and how difficult it is to remain hopeful when we think about what we're up against, the forces that you mentioned, centered around profit and short-termism and extractive industries and these other systems that are so powerful and brought us to where we are. And as you said, we are so far, our reality is so far from the vision that you started describing. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on what can we do realistically? Is it too late? What would it take to really disseminate, articulate that alternative vision, disseminate? What are the conditions for that to be in the mainstream and to garner support for change makers and push back against this? Thank you.
Yeah.
So if we could hear from Tendasai, because she also builds on that idea, and then Jeremy, I think we have a nice, actually an emerging question that seems to be coming together. Tendasai, if you don't mind unmuting and coming on screen.
Yes, can you hear me now? And
Yep.
can you see me? Okay, perfect. Sorry. I was building on Sohela's question and just trying to understand a little bit with some of that despondency with the magnitude of what we're trying to deal with, how to balance existence between what is and the systems that exist now as we're trying to build the new and some of the alternatives that we're looking at. And looking at a way of how to do that in a way that also preserves our well-being as humans. Who also, I saw somebody else put in the chat as well that there's going to be so much backlash as well from these systems that are facing potential for transformation. So just how do you sit in that space, and any advice around that? I mentioned that we had worked with Margaret Whitley here in Zimbabwe, trying to focus on the how of these processes, seeing that there was such a stalemate at so many systems levels. And she talks about these islands of sanity, but at the same time, also knowing that the scale and the magnitude of the scale that needs to transform is quite mammoth. So just a question around how you sit in those spaces and balance that.
Jeremy.
Yeah. Thank you, Tendasai. Yeah, wow. So what I'm picking up from those that set of questions is two themes that are kind of separate but related to each other. And one is this question about the commons and what are these principles of cooperation that can actually potentially work. And the second one is this this kind of question: well, is it too late? And how do we work with a sense of despair or whatever we might have, and that profound issues around that. So let me touch on each of those, and there is, I do think, a relation between them. But first, this one about the principles of the commons. So, well, basically, and I really absolutely recommend the work of this evolutionary biologist, David Sloan Wilson. I put his name in the chat. Tenzin And Tom, he might be somebody that you might want to consider asking to come and speak. He's actually established an organization called the Pro-Social Commons, and he does a lot of work similar to people who may know the work of like Nate Higgins or whatever, work to really begin to encourage these ideas to go out there. But so what he actually worked with Elinor Ostrom, who is the person who first looked at these historical commons. And what he and his team did was want to generalize principles that she found were true of these historical commons to what are sort of what he calls core design principles for successful cooperation. And I can tell you what some of them are. And really, they make such common sense when you actually hear them. It's not like rocket science. It's kind of the opposite. It's our human evolved way of wanting to be together. So things like creating a clear group identity and shared sense of purpose. Things like inclusive decision making. So everyone in the group gets to be part of the decision rather than having a leader tell them. Things like equitable distribution of the resources and benefits based on the sort of contributions people make. Transparency of behavior. Actually monitoring, sort of self-monitoring basically of what's going down. And really importantly, graduated response to both helpful behavior where people get rewards for doing things that are pro-social and unhelpful behavior, but graduated response. So you don't get like kicked out of the entire group if you do a little thing. Mostly because we have such an evolved sense of wanting to be part of our community and valued in our community. A simple recognition you're acting away out of the norms is enough to get most people to make that shift. And when people really don't, then you graduate the responses out. And then there's fast and fair conflict resolution when something does happen. But then there's crucially, that's sort of all are looking at a particular group. Then crucially, if you apply that on a polycentric level, meaning multiple levels of scale, then each group has to have the authority to basically implement all those different parameters, which ultimately means the notion of subsidiarity, which is a core element in the vision of an ecological civilization, pushing the decision-making layers down to the lowest level at which decisions can actually be meaningfully made. And then scaling up, having the relationships with other groups similar to the way that initial group worked together. So you can see this is basically a fractally scalable model that you can begin to see can lead to actually groups beginning to work together in ways that go all the way up to a global layer. And if it does sound a little bit theoretical to you, there's actually examples of this working in real life right now, a shining example, and it's vulnerable to the military dynamics right now. We actually see in the area of where the Kurds live in northern Syria, it's called Rojava. And it's basically because of the power dynamics there. There's a couple of million people were able to actually start to create their own society, which is based very much on these same principles of sort of deep, deep democracy scaling up. And it's been working really quite successfully, given the amount of challenges that are there externally. So this is just to give you a sense. These are not just ideas, but there are things that actually can work in practice. So that is hopefully kind of answers that. And there was this question raised on a related topic of the sort of how the human brain evolved. And I do want to point out that, yes, it is true, and a lot of social scientists have made this point, that when it comes to these wicked problems like climate breakdown or whatever, human brains are evolved to act more to the urgent threat in front of us, and so it's difficult for us to get our hands around it. And all that's true. But I think the most crucial thing to understand about our human brains and cognition is that we evolved to be cooperative. You know, I was saying before how in nature, there's great evolutionary transitions where all different layers of extra cooperation. The evolution of humans as a species was one of those great evolutionary transitions. When we found ourselves like millions of years ago, 6 to 8 million years ago, in the Great Rift Valley, we're no longer swinging on trees because it was more like sparse vegetation. It was a dangerous changeable environment, those groups that learned to work together most effectively and cooperatively were the ones who survived. So as humans, we developed what are known as moral emotions, things like shame, things like embarrassment, or loving people who we see as being generous, whatever. Those are things that we evolved in as humans, which actually differentiate us from other primates. And these pro-social conditions are really designed to bring out what actually how we want to live as human beings. And that's core to understand. As human beings, we did not evolve to want to live in the competitive world we live in right now. But actually, we want to live in worlds where we can be noticed by others around us for what we're doing for community, and we care about community. So that's just something to understand. And then let me turn now to this other question of, well, what do we do given the sense of this unraveling that we see taking place? And while a lot of my work is focused on what is possible, oftentimes people will hear me talk and say, oh, I wish I could be an optimist like you. And I got to say, I'm not an optimist. I look at what's going on. If I had to put odds on where we're headed, looks to me, just like to many of us, we're getting closer and closer to a devastating outcome. The question is it total collapse for everyone, or do the super elites manage to create a fortress Earth? So basically it's collapse for most people while they get to, sort of explore what it's like to be a sort of techno-enhanced, neurally enhanced super species, which from a moral standpoint, I view as even more egregious than all of us collapsing together. But that's where it seems to what I've come. So I mean, personally, I feel a sense of this kind of despair, a feeling of despair almost every day of my life. I've got a voice in me that says, you got to be kidding. We're headed for total destruction. So I have that voice in me, and I recognize and honor that voice. And I think one of the most important things for us to do is not try to avoid seeing how bad things are, not try to avoid the destructions already taking place in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or places like Sudan, places like Gaza, people who are experiencing the absolute devastation of life collapsing around them. We have to hold that. And of course, true of our non-human relatives too, who are being killed indiscriminately around the world. So we have to hold that, but in a way that we hold it enough to energize us towards what is possible, but not so much that it brings us down into this despair. One way of doing that is to be with community and to be with others who share similar kind of understandings. Another way to do that is to actually take that energy and redirect it towards engagement. And I feel that, to me, one of the most crucial layers to understand is basically once we realize that life is not all around us, but we are life, we can ask, what does life want each of us to do in relation to this situation? And my sense is that what life wants us to do is to feel that destruction enough to be energized, but not enough to take our energy out of what's possible and turn it towards just that, even if it's a glimmer of a possible future. Like imagine, like a dark room where there's no source of light, and you're in this total blackness, but then there's just one screen there with just a couple of pixels where there's actually light shining through. Well, basically the notion is the darker that room is, the more your attention can get focused on just those little few pixels that are shining through. And I think that that's for all of us who care about that potential for a flourishing future, need to realize the darker the world gets around us, the more important it is and the more powerful it is to maintain that sense like of a beacon of what's actually possible. And let's not put odds on it. We know we live in a nonlinear, complex world that none of us can actually fully predict. So no matter how many graphs we see leading in the wrong direction, we know that as things unravel, we get into this place more and more of chaos. And in that place of chaos, to that quote of Prigogine earlier, when a system is transitioning from one coherence to another, It's those islands of coherence that are strongest in the chaotic system that is unraveling, that actually determine the coherence and the shape of the new system that it will emerge into. That's the kind of vision that we need to hold on to, and realize that each one of us is not like just kind of watching this thing going on and rooting for the good guys or whatever. Each one of us is part of this unfolding system, and the choices we make each day is part of what will actually shape what happens in the future.
Okay, Jeremy, thanks. And we'll get back later to some of the ideas that you have in the web of meaning on the power of hope. And Tamsin's point about strategic hope. And it's not the same as optimism or pessimism, because both optimism and pessimism can lead us to inaction. But it's that hope and that belief that no matter how small, we can create ripples wherever we are and however we are. So can we go to Brian and Benjamin? And I haven't called upon some of the other people who have put comments in the chat, because basically you posted things for us to read, which thanks. But if you do have a question you want to pose or a point you want to make, please put that in and we'll call on you. We do have about 15 minutes left or so before we wrap it up. So could we hear from Brian and Benjamin? And sorry, Adele has left. She had to leave us, but we were going to call on her too.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Jeremy, I think you've touched on most of my question, but each book that I read on ecological civilization, whether it's Clayton or Corton or others, touch on dimensions or various systems that, along with other writers, will say, you know, if we just change our political system, if we just change our energy system, if we just change this system, that's really the answer. And others say, you know, we just need our moral system. I'm wondering, my answer to that has been, well, yes, all the above. But that seems like an easy answer and a cop-out too. I'm wondering what sort of thoughts you have along those lines, and what angles you plan to take in your new book.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'd love to answer, but Tom, did you want somebody else to?
Let's get Benjamin in, because I think they're linked and you'll be able to answer. But thanks, Brian. Benjamin?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Jeremy. I think it's really fascinating. And as I was putting in the chat, I've been working actually on my own side on ideas that are completely aligned with everything you're working on, and not from a research perspective, but more from an organizing perspective, and thinking about the kind of networks and bridges we need to build to be able to come up with these new meanings and work at this intersection between traditional knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, and modern knowledge, including science. And so I wanted you to develop a little bit more about that intersection, because it seems like it's the main framing for the Web of Meaning book. So if you tell us more about how you see this intersection, and also a doubt that I have, which of course I'm hopeful we can find the solutions to the polycrisis at this intersection, but I also sometimes have doubts about, is there any fundamental incompatibility between some of these traditions and their views around the world, and the modern world and technology in particular. So I just wanted to know if you have a take on that.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions, both of you. Thanks, Brian and Benjamin. So let me maybe start with Brian's question. It sort of leads in a way, just like you said, Tom, to Benjamin. So, and Brian, I love that you asked that question about, we need to change this. No, we need to change that, and then everything will be fine. And as I looked at all this, I began to realize that actually, we do need, the entire system needs to establish a different kind of coherence. Like every one of the sort of great solutions put out there for any one particular thing, whether it's like universal basic income or agroecology or let's see, citizens' assemblies, and each one alone, people can poke holes in it. I think it wouldn't work. The way our global system is right now, if you did that, this would be the counter-reaction. This is what would happen, and it wouldn't actually work. It couldn't be scaled up, and that's actually true. because our system, the entire coherence of the system is designed to encourage, incentivize, and reward basically selfish capitalistic behavior, to reward big corporations, to allow money and capital to reinforce itself. So what is required is basically a different coherence, that every one of these ideas around an ecological civilization, such as UBI, or like, say, redefining corporations so they only can be allowed to maintain their charters if they meet a triple bottom line of not just profits, but also people and planets, for example, or encouraging cooperative-based worker co-ops, or having laws to support the commons. Each of these things could work if they are part of a different ecosystem, essentially, of different ideas, which means that essentially what we have to do is recognize we need to move to that different coherence. So one way to realize that is that when we're in this current system, which is toxic to life-affirming approaches, we have to also be ready to, actually from a funding point of view, to invest in those systems, recognize that they're not able, it's a little bit like if you've got some seedlings and very infertile soil, and only when you plant lots of things together, over time, it'll actually make the soil fertile, and then you'll have a whole different ecosystem. But while you're in those early stages in that infertile soil, you need to be ready to really nurture those seedlings to help them actually grow in a soil that isn't actually right for them, until they can begin to create their own soil, when the whole thing can become self-fulfilling on a sort of permaculture basis. And that's why we have to really start to move towards not just fixing this or fixing that, but getting people more in the mainstream to understand our entire operating system has to be transformed, and that it's doable. But to get there, we need to avoid false solutions. It's very easy when we're looking at this kind of public crisis to say, well, let's just focus on what's doable, like investing in more in renewables, and at least that's something we can actually make some achievement on. But if we focus, and I'm all for that, for investing in renewables, for example, but if we focus entirely on those things that seem to be doable in the short term, we're going to miss the fact that it actually keeps ultimately just moving us in the wrong direction. We have to focus on those kind of things that are often called third horizon, things that actually are out there in the, like beyond what we see as kind of immediately doable, that could allow us together to move into that future. So then turning to your question, Benjamin, really, I think this notion of, well, do some of these ideas we're talking about, they might have worked for sort of like in small scales, or like nomadic hunter-gatherers, but how could they really scale up for basically something that is, you know, this complex technological civilization that we have today? This is where, and again, some of the work of David Sloan Wilson is so valuable. I also would highlight the work of another really fantastic thinker, David Bollier, Bollier, who has written great work about the commons. And there's a great book called Free, Fair, and Alive that he's co-written with co-author Silke Helfrich. And what is important to recognize is that the commons as a set of principles can apply to technology, not just as much as other areas, but even more effectively than other areas. So, for example, there's a wonderful group of people, younger, really visionary thinkers, working on the sort of Web3, which has been the sort of, some people think of it as like the sort of crypto world, which has already been taken over by the global capitalism, get-rich-quick way of thinking. But they're working on reimagining what's possible through, for example, DAOs, which I love the word DAO because I'm somewhat of a Taoist myself, but there's a modern technology DAO, which stands for Distributed Autonomous Organization, DAO, which is basically using blockchain technology to do the very things that Elinor Ostrom talks about in terms of principles of the commons, to allow power to get distributed to the very grassroots and to allow decision making to be truly collective. So there's actually groups of people out there who've literally written papers about taking each of Elinor Ostrom's 8 principles of the commons and showing how DAO technologies can apply that to a distributed architecture for technology. Those are the hopeful things. That's why what we're looking at is not so much something that only works at small scale, but is scale independent. And once we begin to realize some of these parameters that can work, then it takes an imaginative step, because we're so used to thinking in these reductionist ways. But it's not just possible, but absolutely feasible, and can work quite well once those coherence is established to apply that at larger scales, all the way to a notion of how global governance could work. And so like a fractally scaled up set of citizens' assemblies, for example. We're so far where we are right now from there that it begins to sound a little bit like visionary idealism or utopianism or whatever. But again, what we need to realize is that this system is unraveling. It's not working. So we need to be aware of things that are doable in the short term and things that are clearly only going to be doable in the longer term, but keep our eyes on what is possible there into the future.
Jim, you asked actually Jeremy to come in about the breakdown of an island of coherence and a sea of chaos. Did he answer that in his last comments, or do you want to amplify that, Jim?
Well, I didn't see Jeremy's answer, so I'm not sure that he addressed it. I just wanted to make the observation that etymologically, it's not the absence of hope that is despair, but the reversal of a hope. So a hope that you had, which when it doesn't come true, doesn't just fall away, it actually turns on you and causes despair. So perhaps strategic hope, I don't know how to characterize it, but just the notion that if we have a fixed idea of what the future should be and it doesn't come to pass, then we'll despair.
Yes, I think that is a really, really important point that you're making, that it's very, very important not to get fixed on this is what I'm hoping for. Essentially, from a Buddhist perspective, it's really very related to the notion of attachment and this deep recognition in Buddhism that so much of dukkha or suffering in the human experience comes from being attached to a fixed sense of what should be or what we think is. And then because of the impermanent nature of reality, we lose that. And then we either get attached in a negative way, trying to avoid something, or get attached to some new thing. And we're always, by being attached, we're always not being present, and we're always being disappointed or upset or frustrated, whatever those words might be. And to your point, one of the things that's dangerous about getting too much focused on sort of, oh, we can do this, we can do that, is in the world we're in today, probably most of the things that change makers and activists work on trying to improve don't work, because the entire system is designed to stop those things from happening. So it's very hard work, and it's very easy to get demoralized. And that's why, to me, what's important is to really cultivate that sense of non-attachment. But importantly, non-attachment doesn't mean not being energized by a vision of what's possible, by that sort of Martin Luther King Jr. type of a sense of, I have a dream. And because that opens up the possibilities of what we can be moving toward. And that's when we can really begin to see that hope, sort of like that wonderful quote from Václav Havel about hope being not like some sort of sense of what we want from the future, but like a deep orientation of the human spirit, of the human soul. That's really what that kind of generative hope is about. And there's all these great adjectives can be put in front of hope, like Joanna Macy writes about active hope. And somebody put in the chats about that wonderful book by Thomas Homer Dixon that I recommend strongly, called Commanding Hope. And in each case, it's really about hope being not not just a state of mind, but a state of mind moving to action. I think it was Gus Speth who talked about hope is basically a state of mind with your sleeves rolled up, which is a lot of, again, going back to Buddhism, which is a lot of what Buddhism means in that notion of compassion, that when we feel compassion as opposed to empathy for suffering that we see out there, empathy can be exhausting. And it's a necessary part of our human experience to feel empathy when we see the suffering. But if we feel it too much, it brings us down and it's so awful. We'll want to avoid it. And then we might hate the people who are causing the suffering. And so compassion is different. Compassion is a holding, a recognition of the suffering, along with that intentionality to move towards alleviating the suffering. So if we kind of expand out that notion, that spiritual notion of compassion, to how we can look at the world in general, that to me is where we can really hold on to hope in a way that it's more like a driving mission of what life wants from us, regardless of what we see in our way as we move towards that possibility.
That's kind of a great closing statement and inspirational idea to leave us with. So Tamsin, we'll turn to you. And a lot of the ideas have been served up, and what's next and how to, and what's our theory of social change. There's a lot of ideas that how do we get practical? How do we get as well as change, make the transformational change or be a part of the transformational change. So tell us a little bit about what you have in mind on the next steps and our next speakers and how we build on this dialogue over time and become the change we want to see, right?
Yeah, so, well, I feel like Jeremy, there was a fantastic closing and really speaks to, I think the one question that we didn't cover was, which is implicit in what you've said, is why we think of this as a meta crisis, potentially not a polycrisis, right? Which, going back to the whole idea of this being the worldview and the much bigger foundation of what we're building on. And I think this has been an amazing first conversation for what is coming next, which is looking at the notion of metamorphic transformation and really building on the ecological civilization and how we can go. And I know there are still a lot of questions around the how-to, and I think that I'm looking forward to your next book, because if it is covering some of the how-tos, I know that everybody here is going to want to hear about it. But I think in terms of our next conversation would be great. I know that you and Bill, who's going to be in our third conversation, have the connections and the thread that this has really started. And I'm hoping that you've unraveled enough for us to move into a follow-up in April. And I'm just really grateful well, certainly for me and for the RFN and the Impact Trust. I think this was really insightful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And if anybody does have any questions, you're welcome to message Stan or me. We will be sending out the recording with this. And I know that some have asked for the chat, which we will also share, because there is a lot of reference there. And I will certainly connect with Jeremy if there's anything else we can add into this to everybody. But thank you. And thank you for joining us. And please do join us for the next one.
Yeah, well, yeah. Thank you so much, Tamsin, for this invitation, and Tom for kicking it off. And really big thanks to everyone for such rich, deep, thoughtful, piercing questions. Just feels like we've had such a rich conversation together. So I really want to express my appreciation for that.
So would everybody please unmute and put your face on the screen, and we're going to do a closing exercise. And we're kind of have this, I learned this in Kenya, actually. It's at the end of a good session, people clap 3 times together and give their gratitude to the group and the collective, the commons, because of what was done. And then we clap 3 times and take that gratitude and let it inspire us, because we were part of the co-creation. So we're going to do this together on screen, unmuted. And everybody ready? Clap 3 times. Thank you.